Hello, everyone. This is John Singari, Chief Marketing Officer of Active Endpoints, and I'm joined today by Michael Rowley, our Chief Technology Officer. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Our topic today is versioning process deployments in a SOA. Okay, before we get started, just a couple of logistics to really help you, get the best environment here. The middle, the red circle there would be your ability to maximize your screen, so we suggest you do that. And also, the presentation will take 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session. You can see circled there, if you could please enter your questions in that box. It's really, I want to reinforce the fact that we'd like to have as much interaction with you, so we encourage you after the presentation to give us as many questions as possible. CTO Tuesdays is a series. Obviously, we have them every Tuesday at noon Eastern Standard Time. And the purpose is to really give you very relevant topics for what we call the extended development team, from architects to developers, project managers, and obviously the management team that are running BPM and related projects. So we just want to let you know that we'll be having additional ones. You can see the location there, ActiveVOS.com, CTOT, to keep going and listening to Michael in the future. With that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, John. So I'm talking about versioning process deployment. So not just versioning processes, which is something that I believe I've talked about before, but the entire deployment. That's all of the XML and web service related artifacts. In a service-oriented architecture, there are techniques for handling new versions of services and schemas and all the rest. But doing it right, we've found, is very hard. There's a lot of rules to consider. Knowing when there's an incompatible change versus a compatible change, and how to be very careful about making only compatible changes. But then, if it is incompatible, to make sure you change the namespace of the schema. And then, if a schema depends on another schema, and what you depend on changes its namespace, then you should probably change your own namespace because you've become not compatibly changed. And then for WSDLs that depend on schemas, which is most of them, when the schema has changed its namespace, you need to change the namespace of the WSDL, and you need to make sure you put the WSDLs in different locations in your catalog, or in different basically dereferenceable locations, so that you can get them by WSDL location and get the right one. And similar with schema, it's just really tricky. And if you don't do it exactly right, you'll break clients, and a lot of times existing processes will stop working. You'll have a new version overwrite the definition of an old version. The old version would have worked just fine, but because of something that shouldn't have affected it, you end up finding yourself running into problems, and it stops working. So what we thought is that perhaps it can be made easier with an observation that not all of your XML definitions need to be globally visible. There's a bunch of things in a complete process application, a bunch of pieces. So, for example, think about a process application, whether it has to do with loans or insurance or approvals or just anything. There's usually a pretty substantial number of things that go with it. Often, the top line processes will call other sub-processes, so there will be multiple processes involved. There will be potentially many WSDL definitions for interfaces, some of which are used only within the project, like be from process to sub-process. or from a subprocess back to the process. All of these kinds of things are really internal, while some services are external to the process. There's also XML schemas that aren't in external processes. There's some schemas that are used for variable definitions or used for the definition of forms that are presented to human tasks when people are working on tasks. Their form is defined using XML schema. And you've got schemas for internal interfaces and external interfaces. And so the idea is we can really decrease the complexity of handling version changes if we can allow developers to concentrate on maintaining the proper, careful versioning practices, and there's a reason for those things, but do it only for the externally visible definition. The stuff that's internal, we might be able to get away with something that's a little bit more relaxed, because by having a scheme where you resolve most references to XML definitions within the project. So let me, if you think that resolving within the project, we're now using a mechanism called SCA Contributions for working with entire deployments, where you're deploying not just a single process or a single schema or a single WSDL, but deploying them all together. And what we're using as the standard here is SCA. I've mentioned SCA briefly in the past. It stands for Service Component Architecture. It's standardized by OASIS, and it is just in its final stages of standardization. There's a piece of that standard that's called contributions. It's basically in the chapter around packaging and deployment, based on a zip-based packaging format, like jars and wars and all of these things that end in AR. For ours, it's business process archive, so it's a BPR. And that zip file contains all of the artifacts necessary for execution. It contains XML definitions. By that I mean anything where it's an XML file that defines something. So, for example, BPL, WSDL, XML schema, XSLT, even XHTML. But it also defines non-XML definitions that are needed for the thing to run. Or if you have Java that goes along with your BPL. Usually you don't, but sometimes you'll have Java that can be deployed along with it. Java classes and libraries, maybe HTML, straight HTML that's not XML, JavaScript, etc. And all of these things are in your contribution file. The contribution file also has the ability to selectively decide some of your XML definitions that can be exported for use by other, outside of that contribution. And also, these contributions can define imports that says, not everything I'm defining have I specified here. Some of them I'm going to get by importing them from an external definition source, and then another contribution. And that's done by the namespace. Every definition has a target namespace. Some of the namespaces, you say, everything in this namespace gets exported, everything in this namespace gets imported. That kind of granularity, we didn't think it made a lot of sense. We, meaning when I was involved in the SCA standardization effort, the thought was getting the right granularity for what you're going to say is exported and what you're going to say is imported is about the namespace, not the individual artifact. This is similar for those of you who know about OSGI or have heard about OSGI. This is similar to OSGI's mechanism for using for bundles and how bundles can depend on other bundles. It's just that it's really oriented around XML definitions, whereas OSGI is around Java definitions, and specifically Java definitions running in a single process. For us, it's not only it's XML definitions and it's XML definitions that are in a distributed architecture, distributed service-oriented architecture in particular. So in order to achieve this selective import and export, the zip file, just as a jar file has things in the metadata directory, there's also this contribution file that's in the metadata directory that says what are the imported namespaces, what are the exported namespaces, and what are the deployable artifacts. So let me just try to graphically represent all of this change, and the fact that, let's say all of these things are in a process application. Beeples refer to WSDL by the queue name of the interface they care about. And if a beeple calls a subprocess, the beeple refers to WSDL, and then the subprocess refers to the same WSDL. So, for example, this might be the definition of the interface that is the process calling the subprocess. Each WSDL is going to call. Some can import other WSDLs. They will refer to elements within schemas, and then schemas will import and use elements within other schemas, and you get this whole graph of dependencies to make your process application. What we're saying is usually only a subset of those are the things that you're making public, the things outside of you to say, here's how you access me. Those things you want to be more careful with. That things within it, if you can get it so that you know that the interior WSDL definitions are defining something that is unique within your process application. It might, perhaps it's using the same namespace as your old version of the same process application, and you've made some incompatible changes to some of these internal WSDLs. It shouldn't matter. If you deploy the whole thing and all of those references are resolved internally to your packaging, it doesn't matter that you just created an incompatible change, because there's no old clients using it. Old clients are using the old definitions of the WSDL. New clients in the new contribution are using the new definitions, and so they don't get out of whack. They don't step on each other. So, given that, we got a number of benefits around this, coarser-grained contribution-based deployment. You've got a scoped runtime catalog where in the past, ActiveVOS has introduced like a registry, a catalog of all of the artifacts available in your service-oriented architecture. It was pretty much all global. What we're doing with this and following the SCA approach is having it so that there are scoped catalogs per process or per project. So changes deployed by other developers or by subsequent versions don't affect your contribution. So you can have multiple versions of WSDLs, schemas, POJOs, etc. And this is important. The POJO aspect, or Java code, is also important because you can have multiple versions of the same Java code running at the same time. So these can all be running at the same time, not stepping on each other. And you can roll back contributions. If you deploy something new and you undeploy it, all of the old stuff continues to work just as it would. There's no danger of overwriting things. So this, we also provide the ability to hide or expose resources to or from other contributions based on this selective export and import capability. And because of the versioning capabilities, this versioning is something that Active Endpoints has added on to the base concept of contributions. Contributions, everything in there we're using as is, but we're treating some contributions as versions of other contributions. And by doing that, it's easier to track what's going on with the process application. And the overall architecture looks like this, where there's an execution engine that includes a contribution manager that has the global catalog, which is for all of the things that have been exported. But then there's also each individual contribution has its catalog, and all process plans act within a single contribution. And that's really valuable. So for this versioning approach, we've got various states that a contribution can go through. So when you first deploy a contribution, then it will be online, right? Everything, it's the current contribution. Any new work that goes to services will go to try to find an online contribution to go to. Anything that is overwritten not overwritten, the wrong word. Sorry, if you deploy a new version of the same contribution, the old contribution still exists, but it's put into a state called offline pending, meaning any existing long-running processes get to still use that existing definition and all of its service definitions and schemas, etc. It all works together. When all of the processes are done that have been using that, it goes from offline pending into an offline. Then it's available for deleting if you just want to free up the space. There's also another thing called faulted, which is if you go to deploy a contribution and it fails to deploy for some reason, referencing artifacts that don't exist, or there's a compilation error or anything else like that, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, we know it exists. It's there. You can go and look at it in your console and see what went wrong, but it's in a faulted state, and it doesn't prevent the older version from the older version will stay in its online state. So that's the entire contribution. The things within the contribution are in two states. They're either online, which means they're going to be used, or offline, that they're used only by some previous version. So, and then the rules are that, and this top one is really an important one. There's a smaller number of uniqueness requirements. One of the main uniqueness requirements now is the contribution itself has to be a unique, what's called the contribution base URI. And what we do is we use, within Eclipse, we use the project. The project can then become the contract, the base URI or for the whole contribution. And we're tying SCA's concept of a contribution and OASIS, and Eclipse's concept of a project. So within Eclipse, and let me just flip to it, within Eclipse you've got all these projects. And rather than having people come up with a separate concept of what things get deployed with the contribution and how do they align with the project, it's much easier to just say, have a recommended style, that is, put the things in the project that you want to have deployed together. And then by default, the project corresponds to a contribution. Everything in the project will get deployed unless you say otherwise. So, and then only one of these can be online at a time. All of the current process plans, they'll be all online within a contribution, and all current resources will be online. And all the deployments are all atomic. If the whole thing doesn't work, it's as if none of it happened. So let's just look at a contribution transition table. So here is a contribution that has this base URI. It's online, and it's got 2 people processes and WSDLs, schemas, HTML, etc. You get a new version of it. You go, the new version only has a version 2.0. It's got the new version actually changed. Some things changed and some didn't. So we're going to say that that this one actually changed, the process actually changed, and the requirements changed, but some of these others didn't actually change. And so they get a new version, but it's kind of 0.01. The reason they get a new version is so that you can muck with them at runtime. But you can also see that at deployment time, they were the same as they were before. It gives a better sense for what has really changed and what is basically just a copy that's available in this new contribution. So that's what these O1s are. I'd like to switch over to kind of demo. Here is the process, the loan process that some people have seen before. What I've done with this process is I've taken some of it out of this project. What I did is I went with a scheme that I think that we recommend, which is things that you're going to have be common, put into a separate project and refer to it. So I put the schema, the loan request schema, into a new project called Common Schemas. So there's this loan request. Everything within my loan project that needs those schemas is going to get it from elsewhere. This will allow us to version it separately and have these external references. The entire loans project will be deployed when I deploy it. But the way that I refer to that I set the fact that this is going to depend on another project is through the project properties. Project properties have this thing called, and this was already true in Eclipse, project references, where you can say something else in my workspace is going to contain some things that I need in order to compile. And so I'll say these common schemas is where I'm going to get things from. Now, when I go to deploy, instead of picking individual processes I want to deploy, I go to the entire project. I export it, and I'm exporting it into a contribution, business process archive. And I can see that what I'm deploying is this entire loans app. I could, if I want to, not deploy some of the things. By default, it deploys everything, but you don't have to. But then if I go to the next screen, I see all of the artifacts that are getting deployed as part of this contribution. And I also see that what's not being deployed, this loan request.xsd, is not being deployed because it saw that it got that from another project that's going to be deployed separately, and so it doesn't need to deploy it. And it's just telling you what it doesn't need to deploy. And then I'll say finish. Actually, I probably, yeah, okay, here we go. So I get a new version of each of these, and you get the notes associated with the deployment. If I go to the Runtime catalog, I can see in my list of contributions this loans one. I just actually created the 3.0 version of this contribution. Going into its into the definition of everything in that, I can see that there's a bunch of things that are at version 1.02, which means that there were new versions changed, but they haven't actually changed. This is at a version 2.02, which means at some point in the past I changed it to make it 2, and then a couple times I've deployed without changing it. That's the 0.02. And then the process itself is at version 4. And all of this, you don't typically have to care too much. It's kind of at runtime when you're wanting to see this. When you're doing development time and you're actually using it, you typically don't have to care. You just have to know that everything in here uses itself, the other things within the same contribution, and you don't have to worry about it too much. You start thinking about it a little bit, with these when you're using things outside of your contribution, because then you're importing it. But what you import, even for things outside of your contribution, what we do is we make it, and this is something I think is in general a good practice. When you're at design time, the thinking is you're using whatever's the latest. When you deploy, it deploys using whatever is the latest of the loan request, XSE. But as soon as you deploy, it's tied to that version. Any subsequent change to the schema file in the common schemas won't be seen by the dependent contribution until you redeploy it. That makes it so that even when you've got multiple contributions involved, you can, and you're depending on something outside of yourself, you can deploy a new version of that common schema and know you're not breaking anything that depends on it, at least, but then they can take advantage of the change by just redeploying. So that is the basic approach. Just seeing if there's anything else I wanted to show in my presentation. That's the basic approach. We've made it really easy to follow that approach and made it much more difficult to break. That's the headline. Much more difficult to get into bad situations where you break things when you didn't mean to. So that's process versioning or deployment versioning in an SOA. John?
Thanks, Michael. Now we're at the Q&A part. So what I'd like you to do is you should see the questions box, and we highly encourage you to begin to ask Michael questions. And as I mentioned before, this can be one of the most valuable pieces of the session itself. But so go ahead and fire away on your questions. But to get things started, I wanted to ask Michael just for some clarification on this. It sounds like on the versioning piece of this in contributions, could you explain a little bit more? Is this really just for large deployments that people are making a lot of contributions for, or could it be for really smaller kind of deployments?
That's a great question. It does help a lot when you've got a large effort with a lot of different process applications, with certain dependencies on one another, and a big teams of people that are maybe working on different versions of it or working on different processes, and that's easy for them to step on one another. So that's where the sweet spot of its value is the larger the deployment, the larger the effort you've got around process applications, the more this will benefit you. But it's also something that even for smaller, even if you've got one person who's working on a single process application that's just one or two processes and a couple of related whistles, even then it's so much easier to make changes if you don't have to worry every time you make a change whether every whistle is an incompatible change or not, and it just really simplifies even the small case.
Thanks. One other kind of question for you in terms of clarification. You know, as I listen to the presentation, it really gives kind of a clear view of what to do. Any comments of what not to do?
Right. Certainly without this mechanism, there was a lot of what not to do, because you could very easily get yourself into a situation of overriding schemas with the same namespace, breaking existing clients, breaking existing processes, etc. With this, there's still some what not to do's, but they're much smaller. And what not to do is along the lines of, you don't want to deploy the same externally visible service using incompatible whistle, because the client, you know, the guy that you don't have any control over, has been written to call that actual service endpoint and expect something from it. And if you change it so that what he expects is no longer true, that's what incompatible means. The old promises aren't there anymore. But if you break those promises, then that's something to avoid. Just to make that a little less abstract, one way to break a promise is to require that the client send new information. Now it has to include a requisition number where it didn't have to in the past. So that means in the past, your promise was that if you sent me this invoice without a requisition number, it would work. If all of a sudden you now require something you didn't require before, you're now breaking an existing client. So that's an example of some things not to do.
Good, thanks. Next question would be, can you discuss some complexity around versioning interactions with incoming web services versus versioning internal interactions between processes and sub-processes?
Right. Well, the biggest distinction is whether you're in control of the client. For externally visible services, you're not in control of the client. It's bad practice to break your clients, and so that's where you have to be careful along the lines of this keeping your promises. For internal processes using other processes, they do so through interfaces, and those interfaces are defined with whistles and schemas and all the rest. It is always easier to get something to just work, you know, for a client, and you make changes to both the service provider and the client, do testing, make sure it all works, than to if they're together. If you can think of them together, and that's where this internal work is a lot easier. When you have to think of them independently, you have to say, well, clients can change independently of service providers, and service providers can change independently of clients, and you have to consider all the permutations of that. That's a pain. So the best practice is keep things internal that can be internal, so that you don't have to worry about it so much.
Thanks. Next question from the audience is, when will this get ported to ActiveVOS 7.1?
Oh, no, that's not going to happen. That's kind of one of the one of the distinctions about the fact that this is a major release is to say there's something really fundamental about the way we do things that is changing, which is not to say that you can't, for people using ActiveVOS, if you're already using 7.0 or 7.1, it all continues to work in 8, but we did an effort to make it so you can upgrade, because this is a pretty substantial, as you can hear in the description, a pretty substantial change. This is not a backporting effort.
Thanks. Please, any other questions from the audience? I'll just type them into the questions window. Okay, next question. How many versions can be of state in the offline pending state?
One nice thing about offline pending is it's represented by instances and artifacts that are in a database. They really take, I was about to say no server resources, but not actually no server resources, trivial server resources for something that is offline pending and isn't currently executing, which is often the case for these things. They're long-running processes. So, as long as you don't run out of database space, and that trivial amount that is for the server itself, I think is unlikely you would ever run into problems with that. So we're talking hundreds, thousands. It's more than you'd ever run out of.
Thanks. Next question from the audience. Please, again, type it into the questions box. Any additional questions? All right, what I'd like to do is wrap up and remind you again that this is a series every Tuesday, and you can register for the upcoming webinars at the address in front of you. And also, we do have them for replays at the address in front of you. And also, if for any other reason you need to contact us, our email addresses for both myself and Michael are at the bottom of the screen. So we want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll please be back next Tuesday.